Hey guys, so I just finished reading Amy James' Pachinko, and so I just want to share my reading diary with you, my thoughts, and so there will be spoilers in this video, so if you haven't read it yet, maybe you should start this first and pause this video, and so afterwards you can talk about this. So, having read book one, it was quite the ride. We see through generations of the family, and I really love James' writing style that it almost felt like you were watching, or maybe I was watching a Korean drama. I was surprised that Youngjin and Sunja married early, but actually upon searching, I found out that this was actually seen as normal in the 1900s, especially when given the conditions, families would just decide to marry daughters off to escape poverty. And of course, in today's time, we don't want this to happen. It was a really sad reality for them. And fortunately, as for Sunja, the main character that we have was raised by loving parents, Huni and Yangjin. It pained me that the characters had to live such difficult lives. It was the 1900s and females were expected to be mothers and wives, not succumbing to their dreams aside from their usual roles. This was especially highlighted in one chapter when Yoseb was so angry with Sunja for simply trying to help. The part when Sunja was there, her abdomen hurting really bad, she was getting shouted at. It was difficult for me to read that because even though Yoseb only lived in the book and he wasn't anywhere near me at all, reading almost felt like my ears would explode. As a Filipino, I couldn't help but pull out the remark OA because Yoseb's reaction felt like it was above and beyond, and I thought that it was because of his fragile masculinity. But in the later part of this specific chapter, I couldn't help but also feel sorry for him. He grew up in a society where patriarchal expectations were higher than ever, to the point that he'd think he's less of a man just because he received help from women. And the woman just did that to keep them afloat. And so that was really hard to read for me, that he'd think that he shouldn't have gotten any of that help because it's expected for him to shoulder everything, because it was a man's job. He basically hurt himself because of all of these assumptions. And as for Sunja, I could understand why she lied. So many things happened in her life, and so a long explanation wouldn't be easy because along with reliving the story would also be reliving the shame that she felt. But maybe it wouldn't have mattered to the family because they already knew that the child was not from their bloodline. But it mattered to her, especially when she was trying to forget Hansu. It must have been overwhelming for her. In Yosef's anger, he was simply oblivious to how Sunja negotiated at the pawn shop. And she did this really well, that even Kyung-hee, who was years older than her, was impressed. It was not easy, especially for someone who feared trying the other pawn shops, knowing that they're not in their own land. What she did was not ordinary, for sure. She even channeled her desperation into looking like she didn't care at all so she could get what she wanted. But wow, she must have been quite nervous too. One little hint and the dealer could have called on her bluff, and it would have been difficult for them to resolve the matter. At this point of this story, I was grateful that this book was written in third person because I could only imagine how the characters could be unreliable narrators if the book was written in first person. In third person, we get to see many perspectives, and at the same time, I think this is why I felt like I was watching. Reading this book really required me to step back a bit, even when I still had the time to read. In book 2, we were introduced to the rise of the political unrest in Japan, with Isaac and his two church brothers getting arrested for blasphemous acts against the emperor because they were Christians. From here on out, the family would lead difficult lives as they try to survive each day. As a Filipino myself, I recognize that Book 2 contains a lot of experiences and sentiments that are very familiar, especially when our ancestors were also oppressed by the Japanese. And now we may not be in any colonial rule, but the colonial mindset remains, and I can't even deny that I am not affected by it. And I think Filipinos are struggling with this too. So, the first sentiment that got to me in this book was when Joseph was heavily thinking about the analysis of the war, with rumors that Japan will be allied with Germany. The question was that whether it mattered to him, and for sure, that would affect him. He's a Korean under the Japanese rule. But if it mattered to him on a personal level, well, what mattered to him the most was filling his and his family's bellies, of course. And this is true for many families until today, regardless of one's race. Even many Filipinos think the same, which is why it's been talked about that those who have the privilege to be educated about today's politics shouldn't blame the unfortunate, whose day-to-day worries include filling their bellies just like the worries of Joseph. Also, the return of Isaac from prison was really emotional. There were a few times after reading that I was hoping that he would recover after prison, especially when he was able to recover from tuberculosis. But I knew at the back of my head that he would die when I read that the Japanese only returned prisoners to their homes when they were about to die because they probably didn't want to take any responsibility for that. And so that's what they did. I felt so sorry for him living a life, and he was so safe. Most of the time, he saw through Noah, and he said, living every day in the presence of those who refuse to acknowledge your humanity takes great courage. And so I'm not about to cry. I just realized after reading this book that this line was so important to Noah's life. I really thought about this phrase a lot, and I'm sure Noah did too. But seriously, I just wanted to see Isaac live and see his kids grow up, only to read that he died like that. So later in the book, it made sense to me that Go Hansu was actually behind the employment of Kyungi and Sanja. Not that I didn't believe that they could do it. It felt so sudden because I did notice at first that everything seemed to align so well for them, selling kimchi, discovering them, and needing their expertise so badly and so specifically, it almost seemed too good to be true. And there we go. Go Hansu goes on to reveal himself. But I appreciated that Go Hansu didn't really reveal himself until he really had to convince Sanja to run to safety. It was good of Go Hansu to do that and not to show himself, especially when her husband was still alive. He did what was expected of a man for a woman who set her boundaries. I know he's a complex character, and I would see that in the later chapters, and so that doesn't mean that he's redeemed himself. Because the least that he could do actually was to try to make Sanja's life easier as he took accountability for his actions. But unfortunately, as he did this, Noah would later find out that he was actually his real father, and we're back to being sad again. What really bummed me out was that Noah was doing really well at Waseda. And then he changed because his worldview crashed when he found out about the truth, and because he felt that his whole identity was a lie. Of course, all his life he believed that Isaac was his real father, and he admired Isaac so much, only to find out that he had the blood of a Yakuza, and he felt so dirty. Sundra thought that Noah would understand, but little did Sundra know that intellectual capacity was different from emotional capacity. Noah was indeed smart, no doubt about that, but inner person would really take this news heavily, and you would just question everything. But at first, I was confused why Noah hated being Hansu's son, when actually he had already been receiving a lot from him. And I realized maybe he hated it from the start, but tried to endure it in the name of lifting up his nation somehow. That Koreans can be just as sophisticated, like the father that he loved, Isaac. To have the blood of Hansu felt like a different matter to him, probably. And so, it's like a relationship that he never consented to. It would be the same way as his mother and his father. But he at least knew that he was raised by moral parents, and after learning that, of course, that really broke him. Like anyone, but truly as a man, he really only looked to Isaac. He followed his ways, and he was grateful for Hansu for sure. But Hansu was just not the kind of man he wanted to be. Very, very, very far from it, in fact. And so he wanted to start over. Maybe he wondered what it would have been like to have never been born, or lived in a way that was different from the way that he lived. Of course, without Hansu's money at all. How could he stomach that he did not only receive money from a Yakuza, but also have his blood too? He would have entered Waseda thinking about this every day, which he probably thought was nowhere to live. I really felt sorry for Sanja. If only she knew what kind of a man Hansu was when she was 16, she would have never gotten with him. Sure, she was a smart kid, but even smart people can be deceived with wrong assumptions. Though I felt sorry for her, I also knew that Noah's feelings can't be helped. I just really felt sorry for both of them. It must have been very difficult for Noah to write. He wished that he could be with his family too, but the pain was unbearable for him. Intellectually, for sure, he understood, I think, but it was his heart that needed healing. And at that point of the story, I had this dilemma in my head, and I was wondering about how people really heal. Like, does the heart understand when it's been healed, or does it heal when the heart understands? But I just thought that this is a question that depends on person to person. And of course, no one is just as complex. So, just a few minutes after reading book 3, all I could remember was Noah's death. Seriously. I could not remember anything else because I was so hung up on it. One of the last chapters just really ended by informing Sanja and us that Noah had shot himself. And this was just after Sanja and Noah's reunion, and I was just so shocked. And by the next chapter, you would just see that the book suddenly moved on, and it didn't give you the resolution that you wanted. Following chapters focus on Solomon and the new characters he interacts with: Etsuko, Hannah, Phoebe, Kazu, people I honestly didn't care about. Because I was just so shocked about Noah's death. Because what do I care? Seriously, what do I care about Solomon? How about Noah's family? Noah's children? That was my line of thought. Well, in retrospect, though, maybe it was designed like that because though it was written in the third person, we were in the POV of the Becks. Because in the point of view of the Becks, they didn't know anything about Noah's family. And just like his family didn't know about them. I mean, of course, they know the general things like his family was Japanese and that his family didn't know about him being a Korean. But aside from that, I think they didn't know anything else. And so I think she probably wanted us to realize the gap between the families. I'm just glad that the book didn't drag on. Actually, as the book progressed further away from Yangjin and Sunja, the characters I was most attached to, I was losing my interest. So along with Yangjin and Sunja, I was also really attached to the brotherhood of Mazasu and Noah. But then when Noah died, it was like my interest with Mazasu also died down because I wanted more interactions between the brothers and how they navigate life by supporting one another, especially when both of them had been through a lot. Another thing that I couldn't wrap my head around was when Ayame, Haruki's wife, if you recall, was just left having like that after getting us attached with what was happening to her life and the pain that she felt with Haruki's affair. Come on. Of course, I don't have anything against Haruki's sexuality, but regardless, he lied and he cheated. It really made me dislike Haruki's character, having married someone who didn't even know his real identity. She was so oblivious to that. If he was gay and Ayame was okay with it, that would not have been a problem if she decided to marry him anyway. But the thing is that she didn't know. And it's like he stole her life away from her. He basically took her life. Because come on, prove me wrong. It seemed that Haruki just married her because his mother told him so. And because she was a great caretaker. Come on, just hire someone instead of marrying them. A lot of things happened in book 3 and it continued to show how discrimination against Koreans who grew up in Japan and against the vulnerable Japanese, how they were affected generation after generation. This seems to be the purpose of book 3. To show us that whatever the earlier generation did, it affected the generation that comes after them. And we see that in the generation of Solomon in Solomon himself, how he was affected by everything that happened before. And this must be something that we should think about and always remember. Pachinko was a ride, and often dropping lines that would poke the best of us. I have watched historical Korean dramas involving the Japanese, but it's my first time reading a book such as Pachinko that described in great detail the feelings of many Koreans in the 1900s, especially before Korea was divided into two. Because today, in 2025, it almost feels like one Korea never existed at all because, of course, by the time that I was born, Korea was already divided. And so that's all I've ever known. And so that's what it feels to me. So, It was fascinating to me to read about one Korea and how people handled being separated from one another. So Emin Jin's writing is really easy to read. So for those starting out, you could really recommend this book to them. There were a lot of paragraphs when I would read nonstop. I'm also really grateful. And as far as I remember, this is the first heartfelt letter I've read from an author as an opening. So this book actually had a series adaptation and I have yet to watch it, but I'm really excited. I'm definitely wondering if there were any changes to this story, and if there were, I wonder how they were incorporated to the original story for sure. Seeing Lee Min-ho as Ko Han-soo, that was a really good choice for the character because I think his aesthetics really suit the character well. And of course, I'm also curious about the other actors that I will be seeing for the first time. And I think actually I saw the trailer and it looks really good. And I'm really looking forward to watching it. So my reading diary ends here, and I'm really grateful for having this discussion with you. Well, see you next time. Thank you.